Hello guys. So I go by Chris because my name's kind of complicated to pronounce for most of you. So if you have questions, you can address me as Chris. I've been doing denial of service mitigation for a while now, and I do some research on the operation of botnets and this kind of stuff in my spare time. Also professionally as well, but most of it is actually a hobby. So what I actually would like to achieve with this particular presentation is to look into some of the technical aspects of a typical denial of service attack, but also look at on the mitigation side what you can do to actually be more efficient when you're under an attack. So that's if I can get you to think about changing the attitude, how you prepare yourself, that will be pretty much a successful talk. Now, I will not be able to teach you the state machine of TCP or any of the other, deeply technical stuff that you need to do that, but you have a lot of stuff to basically learn on your own. But let's get started and see how it goes. And if you have questions, please feel free to interrupt me and ask questions. Actually, I would like to make this as interactive as possible. That's the first time I'm talking to an audience that's not very targeted, so I know there's a lot of variance. So if you have questions, if something is not clear, let me know. I would like to clear it. So just the usual disclaimer, opinions expressed in this presentation do not necessarily represent the stance of my employer on the topic. And also, if you don't understand me because I speak too fast and with accent, just let me know. I'll try to slow down a little. Cool. So I'll look at the business side. What's the motivation? What considerations you can have, and what kinds of insurance you can kind of think about, and how to be prepared and how to do your monitoring, as well as what are the different attack types. I'll try to make a quick classification of some of them, but then I'll go into more details, classifying them by layer of the OSI stack. There may be some terms that are different from what other people call application, because in the internet stack, the application layer covers everything that is application presentation and session layer in OSI. I'll just go into a little more details there, so don't get confused if you hear something called session layer attack when it actually has been called application layer by other people. They just they have a different reference model for that. Okay, we already did the audience poll, so I have an idea who you are and what you kind of want to hear. So what is a DDoS and what a DDoS is not? So a lot of companies think of it as something that is random, that's never going to happen to them, and then just like the Locust happens one day and they're, oh, what will we do now? Well, that's not very creative, but that's not very productive approach actually to the situation. And you can be prepared. You can also have, in a way, insurance and be able to deal with the situation. Now, when I say insurance, I'll elaborate more in the next slide. But the most important thing is do not panic. It's just packets coming your way. Your site is most likely down, but what does that mean to you? Is your ego hurt? Are you losing X amount of money? There are a lot of things that are different there. And it's not the end of the world. For some companies, maybe the end of the company. But, that's why you have to think about, how much a minute of downtime costs you and so on, but we'll go into that into details. Another thing that is often a misconception is you don't really need any magical powers in order to be able to prepare yourself and to be able to appropriately act in the act of a denial of service attack. You really need to know what you're doing though. So you need to have the qualified personnel, and you don't need to have many of them. You need to have people that actually know what they're doing, and that's it. Actually, I have noticed that in war rooms, when there's something going on and there are a lot of people, usually no work gets done. In many cases, I had to resort to running in another room with a colleague of mine, just working on a plan, executing the plan, having it vetted. But when you have a lot of people in the room, it doesn't work. Okay, motivation. So what is the motivation? Why would somebody attack you with a botnet? Well, you can have financial gain, you can have political statement, you can have, my slides are really messed up here. Anyway, so it's mostly for financial gain or political statement. So it could be your competition. For example, if you're selling furniture on the internet and you have a competitor and they want to push you out of the market, they may be willing to deny of service you. Of course, furniture is probably not the best example, but just put anything that is time sensitive that you have to sell, and if you're off the market, people will switch to your competitor. They actually have done some studies that show that if a customer purchases an item, they always go back to the previous supplier that they used. And for example, if they use you but you're unavailable now, they'll go to your competition, and then from there on they'll pretty much latch onto the competition. Also, usually it takes about 4 to 5 seconds for a user to give up on a website if the website does not load in that much. So, you know, pretty much you have to be able to serve a page and be functional within 4 or 5 seconds. Why am I saying this? This is really kind of, you know, weird. Google loads in what, 0.5 seconds? But again, think about it. You can be able to protect yourself against 10 gigabit denial of service, but this will cost you a lot more money, and you may be able to serve within a second. But again, you may be able to serve within 4 seconds, and you still keep your clients with much less investment. So it's all a matter of balance, how much money you spend. Political statement, here I have hacktivism. You know, everybody's been talking about Anonymous lately, so I won't even mention it apart from that sentence. So the other one is, I'm a cooler kid than you. This is becoming less and less popular, but about 10-15 years ago, this was probably the most, you know, the biggest driver of denial of service. Nowadays, much less, and the kids usually don't have that much of resources. And even if they have a large botnet, they would normally use it for something else. So to use your botnet for denial of service usually means you losing a lot of money, because you could be using that botnet to steal credit cards, steal passwords, in general, steal credentials and something else. So right now, denial of service usually is executed by botnets that by drones that have gone through several stages, you know, stealing financial information, sending spam, and so on, and they're blacklisted pretty badly, so they cannot be used for any of the previous purposes. So then they drop into denial of state, this denial of service state. Of course, people actually sell botnets to each other, but I'll go into more details a little later. Now, look at the following considerations. How is the denial of service different from, let's say, you coming up with a really cool new product, and then CNN pointing their, you know, advertising on your page, or having an article about your product? Well, you have a lot of requests. How's that different from somebody executing millions of gets per second against your site? Not very different, right? How is it different if one of your IPs where you're having your front ends is being attacked and completely taken offline? If you had a proper backup site, you probably already are running either standby or hot. Your backup site has already taken over. So in a way, you can also consider this as an outage. So when you're doing your planning, you can actually look at denial of service events as an outage. And you can say, for example, I want to be able to sustain 0.5 gigabit of traffic, or let's say 1 million packets a second against me, and do not call this an outage condition. That means that you just have to provision the necessary gear so that you can take this amount of traffic and still be up. Now, you can also say, no, I really need actually 10 gigabits of traffic per second to be the abuse traffic sent against me, and I still need to be up above that. Well, you just spend more money, you're more prepared. There are, of course, other ways. You can also use scribbing providers. There are certain companies that provide that as a service. You can also think about moving stuff to the cloud. Well, cloud, the new name of the internet. Anyway, so you know, you can have front ends that scale horizontally and that are stateless. So you can launch an entire set of front ends on Amazon or other providers and have them proxy your traffic, so they can take a lot of the abuse and actually deliver to you only the legitimate traffic. So there are a lot of ways to actually scale that. But again, it's a matter of you knowing your company, how much a minute of downtime costs you in terms of lost sales, or even your name, because you know, for some companies to be down even for 5 minutes, that's really big problem. Like Google, to be down for 5 minutes, everybody's going to laugh at that and not be really happy about it. Now, for you know, mom and pop shop to be down for 15, 20 minutes, an hour, maybe nobody will care. So again, it's about changing of attitude. This is not something that happens randomly. It happens at some point in time. How big of a profile customer you are, or sorry, company you are, depends on, you know, how much you're at risk. Also depends what you sell or what you do online. So if you're WikiLeaks, you may be a little more prone than others. So consider your risk, and based on your risk, assess how much you want to spend. Of course, you know how much it will cost you if you're done. So balance those 3 factors and change your attitude. You can be prepared, And it's not just like you're going to be overwhelmed. Actually, at the end, I'll show some statistics based on the Arbor Networks report. And you see that things can get pretty brutal, but they get like brutal 3-4 times a year for, you know, all of the internet, or at least that's what's based on the survey. And they have fairly large population, so the survey I would call very representative. Okay, a few words about insurance. As I mentioned, insurance is basically money that you pay ahead of time to be protected against something, and then if, you know, it may happen, it may not happen. And that's why I use the word insurance. This is the investment you do in equipment to be able to take the abuse. Things that you really need to have, though, apart from the insurance, is you need to have an incident response plan. Even if the incident response plan means I need to call that guy. But people that are on the job in your operations center, usually this is very junior people, you need to have them ready. They have to know what to do when something like this happened. They also have to have some prior training to be able to distinguish between denial of service and legitimate traffic surge and so on. You also need to have some tools, as I mentioned, gear, and also partnerships. Partnerships tend to be fairly useful if you're a larger scale provider. So let's say if you're having cumulative above 50 to 60 gigabits or more coming to you, you are going to be in a very strong position to be a partner with the larger providers, because at that point you normally will not have any problems with smaller denial of service attacks. And if something is large enough to actually cause you problems, that means that it will be causing problems to your upstream provider or providers. Because usually if you have 50-60G, you probably have at least 3 or 4 uplinks. So know the exact people there that you need to talk to. Don't have a number for their knock and, you know, you call them and then you spend half an hour to first level technician, then another half an hour to second level technician, and all this time you're actually down. Have the names of the exact people you need to talk to. Take them for lunch from time to time if they're in your area. Just build those relationships, because when things happen, you need to be able to escalate fast. And I have found this to be one of the very, very efficient ways. And as I said, with insurance, you know, you may have not planned properly. Maybe that's how it looks from your business perspective. Yeah, you know, you may be down, maybe cheaper to be down for a day than having to buy extra $500,000 of gear. But, you know, this is all business, and I'm not that much of a business guy, but I'm just trying to raise the awareness about this, because a lot of people try to get gear for mitigation and they don't get anything from their business, from the business side. And then they get blamed when something happens and they're not able to respond. Well, this is basically a failure on their side to communicate properly the risks to their management. At least that's how I view it. Okay, so in peacetime, I mentioned have an incident response plan. You should have monitoring set up ahead of time. Why is monitoring important? Well, if you are suffering some network event, I'm not saying it's denial of service, but whatever it is, you need to know how it is actually impacting you. And if you do not know how it's impacting you, how do you know that when you're doing something to mitigate it, it's actually working? There's no way. You'll be just pulling some levers, and you know you have like 20 levers that you can pull, and you do combinations until it stops. Well, it's better if you have some monitoring, you actually see how the graphs are changing and what is happening as you are applying your changes. Also know when you need to escalate, especially to higher management. This is a very interesting point here, because not that higher management will do something, but in many cases you can do a lot of work in mitigating denial of service attacks or other conditions that are similar to that, and they may not be aware. And then when you go next time to ask for more gear, or you want to say, hey, I spent too much time fighting this, they just don't know about it. And if they don't know about it, it's not a problem for them that they have to solve, and it's not a problem for them that they would like to invest money in. So it's about visibility. I really hate to kind of push on the business side, but really in many cases it is a matter of the business side. Yeah. So monitoring impact. As I mentioned, this is one of the things that's very important. It is very often neglected. Many companies start thinking about monitoring when they already have had some kind of problems and have suffered significant outage times. And as I mentioned here, you may be under denial of service attack, but until your users are actually suffering, until you cannot deliver the page within those 4 seconds I was talking in the beginning, you have some problem, but it's not really a serious problem, right? Because you're still servicing user, everything's working fine. You have more time to actually act, and you don't have business impact, basically. You may be paying more for your internet, but it's not like you're not selling anything on your website or your website is down. You should use internal monitoring. You should be monitoring your systems internally and externally, because in many cases something may not be visible from the outside, especially when you have GSLB. When you have your local monitoring, it will be only monitoring things within the different data centers you have. But from the point of view of the end user, you want to see how the GSLB is routing users between data centers and how it's accounting for the load in certain data centers. So if you don't have external monitoring, you may actually have everything looking good on the inside, and then users may still be going to a certain data center and be suffering higher latency because they're routed to the US when they're actually somewhere in Asia, instead of being served by a local data center in Asia. Or other things that I have seen is entire autonomous systems moved around. Spammers do that sometimes. And that's something that is, that you really want to have external monitoring. Question?
Yeah, on the monitoring side, one of the things I've noticed is that sometimes people will assume that there's a denial of service attack because they'll look at a metric like simultaneous connections, and that'll go up. But really what's happening is that they have a performance issue with their site, which means that the collision of people simultaneously using it is increasing because each session is taking longer, so there's just more overlap. So I guess it's just not a matter of monitoring, but really understanding what metrics indicate performance problems within the site versus actual unique traffic increases.
That's a very good point. Do I need to repeat this for the rest of the audience? Did you guys get that? Okay. That's a very valid point, actually. In a few slides down, I'll go into looking at the different bottlenecks, because actually, let me see, where is that? Okay, I'll go back to that in a second, but that's a really good point. You really need to understand your application, and you need to know when you're actually being denied of service, or when, for example, if you're a big media site, when Michael Jackson died, oh man, all traffic through the roof. So, and you may be okay with once a year losing customers because you don't want to spend the extra gear to actually be able to serve those peaks. Nowadays, 10 years ago, that was kind of the case. Nowadays, I don't really see that the businesses may have an excuse why not to be able to serve 10 times or even 15 times their normal traffic. Usually that's not a problem, but again, it's a business decision. It's not so much technical decision. Okay, in the heat of the moment, what is actually happening? Kind of back to your point, actually. You really need to know what is happening. It's not like the site is down. The site is down is a very, very, very vague way to say that something's not working. You need to know, is the DNS not resolving? Are we unable to establish connections? Are we establishing connections to the load balancer, but then from there the load balancer is hitting the servers are actually down? Are we filling in the connection table of the load balancer? So there are a lot of things that you really need to look into the details and actually work based on facts. The fact that the previous week you had something that kind of looked like this thing and the problem was something else, yeah, it may be it, but it may not be. So focus on the facts. Don't really look at what is going. I mean, have some awareness if there's certain types of attacks going on the internet that particular week, or because usually they come kind of in somebody finds a new attack, everybody gets attacked. But look at the facts. See if you're running out of sockets, if you're running out of connections on a load balancer, whatever's happening there. Just be focused on the facts and not on what your gut feeling is. Gut feelings help, but you need to be able to have the facts behind that. So collect data from your load balancer, from your systems, from your network gear. Capture traffic. That's also something that is very often neglected. Even in many networks, the way they're designed, there is no really a choke point where you can actually start capturing traffic. Because in many cases, the load balancers are directly connected to the data center routers or higher order routers, and there the connection is usually 10G or multiple 10Gs. And it's very difficult to actually put a sniffer there. So think about this case. What will happen if I have my site constantly crashing, or if I have something hitting me and I don't know what it is? Well, if the problem is with the load balancer and you don't have a way to insert the device between the load balancer and the router, you have no way to see what is going on there. So think about that when you're designing the network. And if it's not something that's killing the load balancer, but it's killing the host, run TCP dump. That's cheap, you can just install TCP dump on the fly and run it. Now I'm saying install TCP dump on the fly because you normally don't want to have TCP dump and other power tools constantly installed on those machines in case they get penetrated. So again, have a response plan. Okay, I have possible denial of service. It's hitting those machines. My steps are call this guy, install TCP dump, run TCP dump, collect X amount of traffic, and that's it. And very important about response plans, execute it. So you may not get things right the first time. It happens. No matter how smart you are, there may always be factors that you have not considered. So don't go into paralysis through analysis. You just don't get stuck there. Have an idea, have a plan. Make sure that this plan is not going to actually take your site further down if there's some level of availability at that point, and execute the plan. After the plan is executed, monitor. Watch your monitoring and see if the problem is being resolved or not. If it doesn't work, okay, create a new plan. Look at the facts. You still will be able to pull some information based on what you did and if something changed or if it didn't change. Okay, this took a little longer than I was thinking about. Anyway, so attack types. There are many ways to actually to classify the attacks. Obviously, symmetric and asymmetric. Usually asymmetric attacks are more useful for attackers because they have to spend less resources and cause more damage. But if you have a botnet, in many cases that doesn't really matter. So symmetric attacks, just like a simple get FUD, is actually very efficient in taking sites down. Here I'm only listing a few. Actually, this list in no way is exhaustive. Asymmetric DNS queries. If you send a DNS query, do you know how big is a DNS query? 8 bytes. Well, if you have the entire packet, it's about 50 bytes. I don't want to go into exact details, but it's depending on the length of the record you're looking up. Now, if this record has 13 IPs as an answer, well, you're looking at 512 bytes return packet. So if I was to send an IP DNS query to this DNS server over there, and I forge my source IP to be your IP because I'm attacking you, I'm going to send 50 bytes there, or actually 64, and then it will send 512 to you. So here I immediately gained 1 to 8 advantage. So if I can send 1 megabit out to different resolvers, I can have 8 at you, and so on. So this is an example of asymmetric attack.
There was a talk by DJ Bernstein about DNSSEC and the failures with that. One of the focuses was the amplification factor for DNSSEC sign queries is much higher.
Yes, there is, yeah. There are also a lot of implications actually around DNSSEC and if you're doing some kind of GSOB, because depending on availability, you may have to recalculate and resign your answers. So if somebody can in some way make your GSOB think that the data center flops, goes on and off, you may actually also add extra wall on the actual DNS server. But yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so asymmetric, symmetric, reflect, as I just mentioned, actually the attack where you're actually forging your source address in the DNS query is also a reflected attack. What was it, about 15 years ago, there was an attack called Smurf, which was basically pinging the broadcast address of a network, and then everybody would respond to you. And then if you forge the address of the source address of the ICMP request packet, then all this will go to somebody else. So to a fully subscribed Class C network, you can get 1 to 250 amplification, which is not bad. Yeah. Now, another classification is brute force versus logic state attacks. So brute force is when you send a lot of packets and you consume a lot of bandwidth and you make the CPU go crazy. You cause high CPU because of the number of packets. And those are somewhat, in most cases, at least several hops away from you. They can actually be traced because you can see the increase in traffic on the interfaces, and then you can kind of figure out where they're coming from. The attacks that I'm more concerned about are the logic state attacks. Those attacks are usually have very small traffic footprint, but they result into the change of some logic. They exploit the state machine of the target system, and it results in asymmetric resource utilization. So, for example, if you have a query against, think about a address book, if you have an address book of 5 million users, and if you can send a wildcard query. So you send a wildcard query, the result is all of the 5 million users being returned, or at least the database instance behind that has to go through all those and figure something out, or even more complicated query. And you can send many of these, and each of these costs you what a simple get with the HTTP headers will be under 200 bytes. So you're sending 200 bytes in one direction, and then you're causing the CPU on the machine to spike, and you may make it unavailable. Actually, many years ago, not that I hate Oracle, but by mistake actually I crashed one while basically assessing a network, because apparently it only had 4 threads that could process the queries, and I fired 4 queries against this particular database, and it was gone for several hours. Actually, one of the admins had to go and restart the machine so that it recovered. So, you know, that's an attack of a state. That's an example of a state attack. Another one is the notorious SIM flood. I mean, that's kind of funny, but it's been over 20 years now that SIM floods are still effective, and kind of funny, but yeah, they still are. Why SIM floods work? We'll look in a few slides down. Another thing I wanted to look at is backscatter. So if you're having a SYN attack, you send a packet to the victim, and you normally forge the source IP of the sender, which will result in the victim responding with a SYN ACK to the forged IP address. So they will be seeing this traffic. For them, that will not look like anything specific, but if it is a large amount of traffic, then this may cause some monitoring to go off. Usually the backscatter from attacks is very small and it's not that relevant, but depending on how you do your stuff, you may have a broken random number generator, so you may end up always sending with the same source IP address, which is not your source IP, but it's somebody else, and they may actually get a flood of SYN ACKs. So keep that in mind, that you may be also seeing backscatter sometimes. You may not be directly attacked. In all cases, denial of service is a game of resource exhaustion. As I said, it could be bandwidth, it could be the ability of the routing devices or switching devices to process X amount of packets per second. It could be the ability of a database or a web server to have X amount of queries per second. It could be storage. You could be uploading randomly files to a server. You know, the administrator may have the temporary directory set at X megabytes, and you may fool it up, and then as a result, nobody else can upload files to that site. And it could be CPU, as I mentioned. You could just trigger some attacks where the CPU just churns and tries to do something, but you know, it just stays busy and doesn't serve legitimate customers. And you have the application-specific ones where you actually are exploiting specific flow within a specific application which you have researched. And while those are very rare, they're the most damaging ones, because usually they'll pass through all kinds of IDSs, because that means that somebody did a lot of research on you, and normally they will be the attack itself will be very clear on the lower levels of the stack, so the IDSs will not find anything that is unusual, but you know, you'll be hit hard. So that's very rare. Actually, yeah, I only remember one that I had to deal with, and yeah, that at least maybe in my work, you know, in the place where I have worked, this hasn't happened a lot. Maybe it happens a lot in other places. In some cases, depending on how the attacker is motivated, you know, it depends on how patient they are. They may actually go away if you don't seem to be dying fast. If your site doesn't go down, they may actually go away. I have seen cases where relatively small attacks prolong for a long time when the site is not properly tuned and it constantly goes down. You do something, you fix some of the tuning stuff, the site goes up, then the attacker tries and sends some more traffic. So if you stay up, they don't have a way to know how far from exhaustion of resources you are. If you constantly go down and then come up because you added new machines or you changed something, they know that you're about the edge, so it's much easier for them to go and borrow some more bots and send attack against you. So in a way, appearance, the way you stand on the net also is important. Okay, attack surface. So as I said, there are many ways to classify the attacks. I will just focus on the attack surface based on the TCP model or on the OSI. Actually, I'll work on the OSI model, but wanted to show you that The application layer in TCP model is actually covering application presentation and session layer. Somewhat confusing, the network layer is called internetwork in the TCP model, but anyway. Just a little history, the TCP IP model was created long before the OSI model, so some of the concepts in in the internet don't quite fit in the OSI model, but that's the way it is. It's just a hypothetical model. So layer 1 and 2 attacks. Can you give me some ideas? Actually, do you know what sits at layer 1 and 2? Okay, wire is one of the things.
Fiber optic cable.
Okay, fiber optics. Repeaters. Switches, yeah. Okay, so let's see. What kind of attacks can you do against layer 1? Yeah, backhaul. Backhaul is a good one.
Tap. RF noise.
RF noise for wireless networks, yes. Okay, electrical interference. Great.
Wire cutters.
Yep, that's true. Yeah. So now look at all these. Those are somewhat localized. The reason I'm having you name all those is because they're somewhat localized. You need to have access, somewhat have access close to the physical location. That's why those are not that popular as a general internet vandalism, because that means that the attacker actually has to invest some money to fly somewhere and actually risk to be caught by the police, which is somewhat of a deterrent. Now, if somebody really wants to take you down, they will have a backhaul. They'll actually have two for redundancy. Yeah, so okay, carrying cables, power surge, and so on. Okay, layer 3 attacks. Actually, SYN I would classify as layer 4.
Poisoning. Poisoning routes.
That's a good one. Good one. Okay, I have floods in general, ICMP floods. You can have different kinds of flood. Now, actually, one thing I wanted to mention before I start with all of the attacks, almost in all of them you can actually have buffer overflow conditions and other things that are exploiting improper parsing of the protocol headers. Those I did not explicitly state, but they're actually possible in each one of the attacks except for level 1, basically. But you can have bad programmers implement bad parsers and bad things happened. And Teardrop is actually one of the examples of this. When you have IPs with overlapping segments, this was causing the Linux kernel to crash. I think it was about 10 years ago. Fortunately, we don't have problems of that type, but it's good to keep in mind. Layer 4, SYN floods was already mentioned.
Firewall state table exhaustion.
Excellent. Or connection table in general. So this is the same thing, but for load balancer it will be only a state connection state. What else? Okay, SYN flood, RST flood, FIN flood, you name it. Any flag that can be set in the TCP packet you can have. Why is it so important? Well, with SYN flood you're only exploiting the ability of a host to initiate new connections, and there are actually some ways to defend against that. With an RST flood you're hitting something else. If you have a RST set in a packet, the host that is under attack has to go through the entire state table. That means every single connection it is handling, and see, hey, do I have a connection from this IP to this IP, from this port to this port? And then only when it finds that connection, it can actually apply the reset rule. So if you have a load balancer that is concurrently running about 7-8 million connections because it has a large farm of servers behind it, and if you send the reset packet to it, it will have to go through all of those sessions and make sure that that the RST packet does not match any of them before it actually drops the packet. So from that point of view, an RST will be much more expensive than a SYN attack. Now, if you have only 100 connections in the table, obviously a SYN attack will be more expensive because you have to do more calculations in the load balancer to actually return the SYN cookie. And what is a SYN cookie will go in a second. So another one, layer 4 attack is a connect attack. Actually, it's also known as socket exhaustion. This is when somebody connects and disconnects to a port. They can also do get, but this will be more of a session layer attack. But connect attack is like connecting, disconnecting, connecting, disconnecting, connecting, disconnecting. Does anybody know what will happen if I connect and disconnect really fast to a host? Time wait. Why do you have time wait? Yeah. Excellent. Cool. So I'll go in more details in a second, so that's why I'm not repeating it for the audience. And the last one I was actually thinking about layer 4 is LAND. LAND was something that was, again, used probably about 12 years ago, was when you have packet sent that has the same source and destination IP address, and it would confuse it was Linux attack specific, and it would actually crash the kernel. So happens, but again, layer 4, because it is exploiting actually it actually had to be against the TCP port. That's what I forgot to mention, because otherwise, if it was just about IP address, source IP addresses, it would probably classify as layer 3. Layer 5, I already mentioned get FUD. So Walrus is one of the examples. This is when you have a connection opened and then you send header by header. Now, something that is actually more efficient than that is if you open a port, if you open port 80, for example, and if you start sending byte by byte, when you're sending header by header, as in Walrus, you still have some ability to actually parse the headers and cancel the connection. Different types of software has different plugins. You can write a plugin that can easily detect some patterns in the headers that are being sent against you, and possibly reset the connection before it has wasted too much time for you. Now, when it's byte by byte and when there is no new line in it, it starts to open this buffer for the first line that grows. And I have seen software that would actually go pretty much until 50K. so think about a character sent every second, 50,000 characters, before actually the software decided, hey, you know what, I don't think I'm interested in that connection. So yeah, think about if you're running an Apache that has 200 children. That means that you can have 200 connections in parallel. And if I have to send a byte a second, that means 200 bytes a second against the Apache server at the application layer with all the encapsulation. That is 65 packets. What is that? We're going on 13K. 13K traffic can actually 13 kilobits per second. You can do that with a modem. You can keep the Apache busy. So that's another type of attack. I don't think it has a name actually. Actually, there was some speculation that Xerxes was something similar, but I can't really tell. Okay. Layer 6, presentation layer. This is where all the different file encodings, XML and so on would sit.
I've seen zip file explosion attacks where you can get a very high compression rate.
Good one.
From like dev 0, just a zip file compressing dev 0, and then if they have like something that's a proxy that's inspecting for malware, it'll try to blow the file up in memory or something like that.
That's a very good one. Yeah, that's a good one. Anything else? Yep, very good one. There's an example. So you have wall 1 is defined as wall 2, wall 2 is defined as wall 1, then you invoke it, then you have a recursion. There was also another one. Actually, this one was presented, was it in March? No, it was actually in February this year at Black Hat. And there was another set of XML attacks that were basically using the fact that by applying logic, you can have huge expansion once the document is parsed. Another one, layer 6 attack, would be just expensive queries. Just think about asking a website to generate a very expensive image that comprises of collecting information from many different places, and you do that many times. Okay, layer 7. That's kind of tricky one. Well, we can call spam, and here I know that I'm not exactly correct here with the layer 7 attacks, but anyway, so it could be just DNS queries, denial servicing the DNS server, because this would probably go as a session attack. It could be spam. Black fax is actually an attack that is layer 7 attack.
You tape it into a circle and run it into the fax machine.
Exactly. So yeah, and you can just have something that frustrates the user, which would effectively be layer 7 attack. Anyway, so what is TCP? Most of you know what TCP is. I mean, not most of you, I'm sure all of you know what TCP is. A few things to consider around TCP. A lot of people are bashing on it and how the people did very bad job about designing the protocol. You know, I kind of have a little different take on that. Because this protocol was designed, the first RFC was from 1981. Okay. Yeah, I was born, but it wasn't long before that. So if something was able to survive for that long, I'd rather not bash on it, and I'd rather learn it. So there's a lot to be learned from the RFC for TCP. It's just amazing how much information there is. Every time I reread this RFC, I find something else that I haven't paid attention to the previous time. So I very strongly encourage you to read RFC 793, and there are also follow-ups with some of the TCP options and so on, but it's fairly interesting information. Now, I don't know in how much details do you want me to go into the packet, into the header? Yes? Okay. So we start with the source port and destination port. So this is de facto an address of layer 4. Address at layer 3 would be the IP address. Address at layer 2 would be the MAC address of the frame. So here we have address at layer 4, which is source port and destination port. We also have sequence number and acknowledgement number. Those are used in order to figure out if you have all the data that was sent to you, and basically that's what they're used for. Data offset is used to, once you have options in the file, you actually can specify how far along the packet, the actual data in the packet starts. Then you have the 6 flags, which are urgent, acknowledgement, push, reset, SYN, and FIN. We'll go over SYN, FIN, reset, and acknowledgement in a few minutes. Urgent and push have the following implications. If push is set, that means that the receiving application, the receiving TCP stack has to immediately push the data to the application. Under normal operation, what will happen is you have two sides talking to each other, and the TCP stack has buffers. So when this guy sends a lot of information, it will stay in the buffer until the buffer is full, and then it will be pushed up to the application. And if you set the push flag on, that means that the moment the packet is received, even if the buffer is 50 bytes full, it will be sent up. Why is this important? Well, whenever you're moving from the TCP stack, which runs in kernel space, to user space, you have context switch. Context switches are extremely expensive, extremely expensive. So if you're talking to a web server, and if you send byte by byte packets on a regular stream, something that actually a normal IDS system may not catch, but if you have push flags set in each of these, this will cause every time for the control to be passed to the to the process in user space, which will take a lot of resources. The next one is urgent pointer. This is used in out-of-band communication. If you have some data, there's this notion of out-of-band communication where you can have a lot of data going through, and then you can send out-of-band data, which is really important, has to be taken care of first. Not quite like the push flag, but why am I mentioning it? There was an attack called WinNuke a long time ago, where actually you could exploit this to crash the Windows kernel. It was just improper implementation of the out-of-band data handling. So, window. What is a window? A window is when the two parties are talking to each other, one of them gives a sequence number, and then this guy acknowledges the sequence number and says, hey, I received the data up to that point. Actually, it's sequence number +1, and then it gives a window. It says, and I actually have space in my buffer for X more bytes. So if you have a large window, that means that you can acknowledge the packet, and then the other side can send many packets until the window is exhausted. Well, let's look at the other side. If I say that I have a window of 1 or window of 0, that means that the other side can only send 1 byte at a second, pretty much, if I have window 0. So if I'm a malicious client, and if I'm talking to a web server, and if I consistently set my window as 0, and if I request a large page, this page will be rendered in the memory of the server, and then it will have to byte by byte deliver it to me. Okay, 1 byte will have to be encapsulated with a TCP header, IP header, and then there will be a MAC frame data link layer frame there. So that's a lot of work for the web server actually to send that data back to me. So this is another asymmetry that you can have in the way you're exhausting the resources, because it costs you very little to actually cause a lot of work for the server. Now open many pages, and it will take a while. Okay, checksum. Checksum is calculated only over the control information. Actually, it's calculated over something called meta header, because it not only covers the layer 4 information that is in this header, but it also takes the source and destination IP addresses. And if any of this data is corrupted, the checksum will not match and it will be dropped out. Urgent pointer, it is used with together with the urgent flag. When you have out-of-band data, it tells you where the out-of-band data actually ends. Options, you can use different TCP options. That's a long story there. And then you have the data. So that's how the header looks. Now, what is interesting to know about TCP? TCP is implemented as a state machine. That means that you have distinct states in which the machine can be for every connection. And to move between states, you have to meet certain conditions. Those conditions are coming from the fields in the packets that are arriving in the receiving application, in the receiving TCP stack. So, for example, if you see a SYN flag, that means, oh, somebody wants to talk to me. Now I'm going to switch into a different state where I'm going to actually send them a response, and I will wait for them to confirm that, and so on and so on and so on. The state machine is about 15 to 20 different states. It is in the RFC. I did not want to go into more details there, but if you have questions after the talk, I can show you the machine. The key states that actually you may want to know about it are listen, SYN, receive, establish, their fin wait 1 and fin wait 2, and then there's the notorious time wait, which we'll talk a little more about. So listen is the host application has attached to a port and it is ready to accept connections. Then it can go into SYN receive when the other party, there you go. Yeah, I should have had a slide. Okay, so I'll use this slide. This is actually a SYN forward attack, but I'll use it to illustrate how it works. So the right side is our receiver. It will be in listen state until it receives the first SYN packet. Then it will respond with a SYN and acknowledgement to the client, and it will move into a state SYN receive. Then from there, the client would normally respond with another acknowledgement, and actually from that point on, they will constantly be sending acknowledgements to each other, and the connection will go into the established state. Once they decide to tear the connection down, depending on who initiates the tear down, one of the client will go either in fin wait 1, fin wait 2, and then ultimately when the connection is completely closed, it will go in time wait. So why is this important? Now, first thing that I would like to note is that you can the difference here in TCP is that you actually have two one-way connections. It's not one two-way connection. So one of the sides can close the connection, but the other side can continue talking to the other side, and this is perfectly legal in TCP. And one example would be if you are tailing a WOG file and if you actually exit your shell. In some cases, actually, your SSH session may not die because you're still receiving data. You have closed the connection to the server, but the server still has the connection open to you and it's still sending you information. So that's about the fin waits. Now, time wait. Time wait is a very, very interesting one. As I mentioned, the protocol was designed some 30-something years ago. And at that time, packets were moving much faster. Much slower. So I don't know if you have read the RFC about TTLs, but the reason it is called TTL, time to live, and not hop count, is because the definition is that the TTL field has to be decreased by 1 for every second the packet spends in the queue of the router, for every second. That means that when people were talking about it initially, they were considering that I'll send a packet from here to here, it will stay there for 3 seconds, then we'll go to the next one, stay there for 2 seconds, and hopefully within 16 seconds it will probably go from Alabama, well, let's actually, it was in Los Angeles and what, I forgot which universities at that point were. Yeah, so that's the way they were thinking. And at that time, they were right. You know, they set something called MSL. Do you know what MSL is? Mean segment lifetime. So they set this constant to 30 seconds. And they said, okay, so if we have a packet that was sent from this host to this host, from this source port to this destination port, And if this connection gets closed, and then immediately a connection from the same source IP and source port to the same destination IP and destination port is open, there is some chance that some packet was lost somewhere in the network, and it may actually still come back and be re-injected in the second connection. And we don't want this to happen because we have some data corruption. So they said, okay, we know that the MSL, we defined it to be 60 seconds. That means that no packet should survive in the network for more than 60 seconds. Let's double that. So that means that you should actually stay in time wait for 120 seconds. Now in Linux, this currently is implemented, MSL is currently 30 seconds, which means that you only have to stay in time wait for another 60 seconds, which is still too much time. So you can drop the MSL and you can actually stay in time wait state for much less than that. I found that 5 to 6 seconds is actually reasonable, because 5-6 seconds, this is the packet can literally, if you're not using satellite links, you can go around the world about 8 times in 6 seconds, something like this. So it's not a problem nowadays. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so here really fast, what happens with the socket? Here we have it in listen state, then we have it in established state, then we're in time wait state. Then wait at 60 seconds, and there's nothing there. Your best friends actually, and this is very basic, I know most of you probably know about those tools, but learn how netstat works. Just, learn all different options that you can use with it. Then TCP dump. Know exactly what you need to do to start capturing traffic as soon as possible, because in most cases this will be your lead, your most junior guy in the network operations center that has to run this command at 3 o'clock at night, because this is when some people in Asia are awake and they just want to, take somebody's website because they said something mean in high school. So you have to have this documented. I know it's very simple. I normally have, most people don't have problem with that, but I have noticed that junior NOC engineers need to have it. Of course, another detection, dedicated, IDSs and stuff like this, but that's different ball game there. Mitigation. So mitigation depends a lot on the layer of the attack, depends on the specific resource that is affected. You can do it yourself. You can get your own dedicated hardware that does that. There are several vendors that I actually like a lot. I don't want to kind of go into advertising vendors, but definitely Arbor Networks and Radware are really good denial of service mitigation devices. There are others, but those are the ones that I have personally tested and have survived. So really like them. You can tune your software. You can also change your architecture. That's something that's also that can be considered, but you definitely cannot do that, short term. Scrubbing providers, there are certain companies that you can send your traffic to, and then they will return the clean traffic in a GRE tunnel back to you. That's an option. So as I said, horizontally scaling, you can just send stuff to the cloud, and so on. How does a SymFlood work? Okay, so we're kind of running out of time. So do you want to hear how SymFloods work? Show of hands. Okay. So the receiving server has a certain size of the state table that it can keep. How many connections, how many requesters are wanting to talk to them. So this usually is about 2048. That's what the default for Linux for 2.6 30-something kernel is. So those connections, basically, if somebody opens has more than 2,000 pending requests to you, you'll be out of slots and you will not be able to accommodate anymore. Thus, effectively, the service will be denied to all of the users that are trying to talk to you in the meantime. Now, what you can do is you can actually how it will look if you have a SymFlood. So this is a netstat, not the SYN receive state for most of those sockets. And normally you see something like 2,000 of these or more. What you can do? Well, you can do sync cookies. Sync cookies is one of the actually better ways to mitigate it, though it is somewhat CPU intensive. Sync cookie basically is a specific hash that is hidden into the sequence number field when you're responding. So you actually receive the packet, you do some magic calculation there, and you send it back, and then you forget that you ever talked to that guy. Now, if they return a packet that has the same magic hash +1 because they're acknowledging it in the packet, then you know that you really talked to that guy in the past and you establish the full connection in the stack. How is this calculated? Well, let's look here. Basically, it takes the timestamp module 32. That means that it will shift it to the, this will be to the right 5 bits, which means that you lose precision in 64 seconds, which is actually useful because those packets will be traveling around and time will be passing as they're traveling. So 64 seconds may be a little bit of an overkill, but it's safe. So then it also adds the segment size, and then it also adds this 24-bit hash. In the hash, it takes into account the server IP, server port, client IP, client port, and the timestamp that I mentioned above. Then this number is actually a 32-bit number. It's hidden in the sequence number. It is sent to the other party. If the other party is honoring the way TCP works, which they basically have to, they're going to increase that by 1, return it to you. You subtract 1, do the same calculation. If the numbers match, that means you talk to that guy. So that's how sync cookies work. What is bad about them? Well, the problem is that if there were any TCP options sent in the first packet, you just lost those. There's something called extended sync cookies that allow you to keep some of this information, but they're still not very efficient. However, in most cases, if you're under attack, you don't care. Because those options, the TCP options, normally help you optimize the connection. We're talking about saving something like 5 to 10 milliseconds on a 30 millisecond round trip connection. Not that big of a deal. So, you know, you can lose, and the alternative is you not being able to take the connection at all. So which one do you choose? How would a GET attack work, or actually socket exhaustion? Well, you have everything in time wait, basically. You know, the connections were open, they were closed, a lot of sockets in time wait state. How do you mitigate this? Well, the easiest way actually to mitigate it is to enable socket recycling and socket reuse. You don't even need to drop the MSL down. You can just recycle the sockets. So that's how you enable that. Okay, mitigation of the upper layers. Basically, you can change the way your application works, as I mentioned. For example, Apache uses the process-based model, where you have one thread handling one connection. And if somebody opens many connections to you and just sends byte by byte by byte by byte, all of your threads are busy, you can't take new connections. Nginx, it basically has a long queue and list of connections that it's processing. It just circles between them. Very fast, very efficient. Also, Apache uses, on Linux in particular, it uses kernel level threads. What is the problem there? Well, kernel level threads, you basically have a new process for every thread. And because of that, you have certain time to switch between the different processes, and this time is very expensive in general. With Nginx, everything stays pretty much in the same process, and it's just a for loop with non-blocking I/O. You can look at Nginx on the web. There's also actually Alex Behar from Radware released plugin for Nginx called Robu. Go to ECL Labs and you can get more information. It's basically a plugin that reads the incoming packet headers and makes some decisions and will drop illegitimate traffic. Also, it will challenge clients. For example, it will give it a JavaScript challenge, and if the client can parse the JavaScript challenge, it will actually let it see the real page. It also uses Silverlight, so if it's a Windows browser, it will actually send it Silverlight instead of JavaScript. The idea here is that if you have a simple botnet that just opens sockets, you can have it look at cheap pages that are really fast to generate and will be served from memory, and then from there sent to the more expensive pages. Okay, how do you DDoS? So how are we doing on time? I guess we're out of time, right? Is the next speaker here? Okay, cool. Okay, before I finish, I just wanted to mention there's a conference I'm organizing in the north, in the Bay Area, San Francisco. So if you're interested, you can, look at it. It's December 9 to 11. And if you have any questions, I'll be in the other room, so I can show you the rest of the slides, and I can show you more about how botnets are operated and so on. Thank you, guys.